The desert sun beat down on Jake Morrison's shoulders as he stood in the dusty parking lot of the county courthouse. In his weathered hands, he held a deed to a property he'd just purchased for $100. It seemed too good to be true. And perhaps, in ways he couldn't yet imagine, it was. Jake was a man of simple pleasures and modest means. At 53 years old, he'd spent most of his life working construction in Phoenix, Arizona. His hands were calloused from years of honest labor, and his face bore the deep lines of someone who'd spent countless hours under the unforgiving southwestern sun. He wasn't rich, but he'd managed to save a little money over the years. Enough, he hoped, to finally pursue the dream that had been growing in his heart for the past decade. He wanted to restore something beautiful, something forgotten, something that deserved a second chance. The property he'd purchased was an abandoned mission located about 40 miles outside of Phoenix, nestled in a remote valley between rust-colored hills. St. Catherine's Mission, it was called, though most locals had forgotten its name entirely. It had been built in the 1800s by Spanish missionaries, a small outpost meant to serve the scattered communities that once dotted this harsh landscape. But time and progress had moved on, leaving the mission to slowly crumble beneath the relentless desert sun. Jake had first seen the mission 5 years ago while exploring back roads on his motorcycle. Something about the lonely structure had called to him. Despite its deteriorated condition, he could still see hints of its former grace in the weathered stone archways and the bell tower that stood like a silent sentinel against the sky. When he learned the county was selling it for just $100 to anyone willing to take on the restoration, Jake knew it was meant to be his. Now, driving his old pickup truck down the narrow dirt road toward the mission, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The property came with conditions, of course. He had to stabilize the structure within 2 years or it would revert to county ownership. It was a daunting task for a man of his limited resources, but Jake had always been good with his hands. He figured if he worked slowly and carefully, he could at least preserve what remained. The mission appeared on the horizon like a mirage. Its sand-colored stone walls seemed to emerge organically from the desert floor, as if the building had grown there rather than been constructed. The roof had partially collapsed on the eastern side, and the wooden doors hung at odd angles. But the main structure still stood, defiant against the elements that had tried to claim it. Jake parked his truck and sat for a moment, just looking. A warm wind whispered across the valley, carrying with it the scent of creosote and sage. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried out. The isolation was complete. The nearest town was 15 miles away, and his closest neighbor was a rancher who lived 6 miles to the north. This would be his sanctuary, his project, his purpose. He spent the first week simply cleaning. The interior of the mission was filled with decades of accumulated debris, tumbleweeds, broken pottery, shattered glass, and layers upon layers of dust. Jake worked methodically, sweeping and hauling, taking breaks to drink water and wipe the sweat from his brow. The main chapel was surprisingly intact. Stone columns rose to support what remained of the vaulted ceiling, and the walls still bore faded traces of painted decorations. Someone, long ago, had cared deeply about this place. Jake could feel it in the craftsmanship, in the careful placement of each stone, in the gentle curve of the archways. He set up a small camping area in the corner of the chapel that still had a roof. A sleeping bag, a camp stove, a cooler for food, and a battery-powered lantern. It wasn't much, but Jake had lived rough before. The simplicity felt right somehow, as if he were becoming a temporary guardian in a long line of people who had watched over this sacred space. Each day, he worked until his muscles ached. He shored up walls, cleared drainage channels, and documented the damage with careful photographs. In the evenings, he would sit outside and watch the sun set over the desert hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed to set the world on fire. It was during his 3rd week at the mission that Jake made his first discovery. He'd been working in what appeared to have been a small office or study adjacent to the main chapel. The room was in poor condition, with most of the ceiling gone and the floor covered in fallen plaster and broken timbers. Jake was carefully removing the debris when his shovel struck something solid beneath the rubble. He knelt down and began clearing the area with his hands. What emerged was a section of floor that didn't match the rest. While the surrounding floor was made of simple adobe tile, this section was constructed of fitted stone. And at the center was an iron ring, green with age and corrosion. A trapdoor. Jake's heart began to beat faster. He cleared more of the area around the door, finding its edges. It was about 3 feet square, set perfectly into the floor. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each stone cut to fit precisely with its neighbors. He grasped the iron ring and pulled. The door didn't budge. He tried again, putting his weight into it. Still nothing. The door must have been sealed shut by rust and time. Jake retrieved a crowbar from his truck and worked it carefully around the edges of the door. Little by little, he felt it begin to give. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, the door lifted free. A wave of cool air rushed up from below, carrying with it the scent of earth and stone and something else. Something that smelled faintly of old paper and incense. Jake shone his flashlight down into the opening. Stone steps descended into darkness. His hands were trembling slightly as he tested the first step with his weight. It held firm. The stone was solid, carved from the bedrock itself. Slowly, carefully, Jake descended into the mission's hidden depths. The stairway went down about 12 feet before opening into a small underground chamber. The space was perhaps 10 feet square, with a low ceiling supported by thick stone pillars. The walls were smooth and carefully plastered, still intact despite the years. But it was what the chamber contained that made Jake catch his breath. The room was filled with wooden crates and boxes, stacked neatly along the walls. In the center stood a heavy wooden table, and on that table lay several leather-bound books, their covers thick with dust but seemingly undamaged by time. Jake approached the table slowly, hardly daring to breathe. He lifted one of the books and gently opened it. The pages were covered in careful handwriting, in Spanish, dating back to 1873. It appeared to be a journal of some kind, documenting daily life at the mission. He set that book aside and examined the crates. The first one he opened contained more books and documents, all carefully wrapped in oilcloth. The second crate held religious artifacts, silver candlesticks, a chalice, several crosses of varying sizes. Nothing of enormous monetary value, but items that clearly held great significance to the people who had hidden them here. The third crate was different. Inside, wrapped in layers of protective cloth, Jake found paintings. Not large ones, but each was exquisitely rendered on wooden panels. Religious scenes mostly, done in the colonial style, with rich colors that had somehow survived the centuries. There were perhaps 20 paintings in total, each one more beautiful than the last. But it was at the bottom of the crate that Jake found something truly extraordinary. Wrapped in the finest silk cloth was a small painting, no larger than a sheet of paper. As Jake carefully uncovered it and shone his light upon it, he felt his breath catch in his throat. The painting depicted the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, rendered with such skill and delicacy that it seemed almost alive in the flickering light. In the bottom corner, barely visible, was a signature and a date, 1797. Jake sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He wasn't an art expert, but he knew enough to recognize that what he was looking at was very, very old, and very, very special. Why had these items been hidden? When, and by whom? Over the next few days, Jake carefully cataloged everything in the hidden chamber. There were 27 paintings in total, dozens of religious artifacts, and 32 journals documenting life at the mission from 1871 through 1896. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, spoke of Apache raids in the area and the decision to hide the mission's most precious items for safekeeping. The missionaries had apparently planned to return once the danger had passed. But for reasons lost to history, they never had. The mission was eventually abandoned, the hidden chamber forgotten, and the treasures left waiting in the darkness for someone to find them. Jake knew he needed help. This was beyond his expertise. He contacted the Arizona Historical Society, and within days, a team of experts had descended on the remote mission. What followed was a whirlwind that Jake could never have anticipated. The paintings, it turned out, included works by several important colonial artists. The small painting of the Virgin Mary was particularly significant, as it was believed to be one of only 3 known works by a mysterious artist known only as the Master of Santa Fe. The Historical Society estimated its value at over $2 million. The journals were equally important, providing a detailed record of daily life in a Spanish mission during a period for which few records existed. Historians called them an invaluable resource for understanding the era. The news media got wind of the story, and suddenly Jake found himself at the center of a media sensation. Local man discovers priceless treasure in $100 mission, the headlines read. Reporters came from as far away as New York and Los Angeles to interview the soft-spoken construction worker who'd made such an incredible discovery. Through it all, Jake remained humble and somewhat bewildered by the attention. He hadn't bought the mission looking for treasure. He'd bought it to restore something beautiful, to give it a second chance. The treasure had simply been an unexpected gift. The question now was what would happen to the items he'd found. Legally, as the property owner, Jake had a claim to the treasure. But he'd never felt right about that. These items belonged to history, to the community, to the people whose ancestors had created and cherished them. After much consultation with lawyers, historians, and his own conscience, Jake made a decision that surprised many people. He would donate the majority of the artifacts to the Arizona Historical Society, with the stipulation that they be displayed in a new wing dedicated to the mission's history. A few items he would sell, but only enough to fund the complete restoration of St. Catherine's mission. The rest would go to establish a foundation to maintain the mission and make it accessible to the public. The small painting of the Virgin Mary, the most valuable item in the collection, he donated to the National Gallery. He asked only that a plaque be placed beside it, telling the story of the mission and the missionaries who had safeguarded it for future generations. When asked by reporters why he was giving away a fortune, Jake simply shrugged and said, "It was never really mine to keep. I was just the one lucky enough to find it." The restoration of the mission took 3 years. Jake oversaw every detail, working alongside a team of expert craftsmen and preservationists. The roof was rebuilt using traditional methods. The walls were carefully stabilized and repaired. The chapel was restored to something approaching its original glory, with the faded painted decorations painstakingly recreated by artists who specialized in historical restoration. The hidden chamber was left intact, preserved exactly as Jake had found it, so that visitors could see where the treasure had lain hidden for over a century. On a warm spring day, with the desert flowers blooming in unlikely profusion around the mission grounds, St. Catherine's mission was officially reopened to the public. A crowd of several hundred people gathered for the ceremony, including state officials, historians, local families, and even a few descendants of the original missionaries who had served there. Jake stood in the shade of the old bell tower, watching as the crowd moved through the restored mission. Children laughed and ran through the courtyard. Elderly couples walked slowly through the chapel, their faces soft with wonder. Historians examined the journals in the new research library that had been established in one of the outbuildings. The mission was alive again, no longer a crumbling ruin, but a thriving center of community and history and beauty. A young woman approached Jake, a child of perhaps 7 or 8 holding her hand. "Mr. Morrison," she said, "I just wanted to thank you. My family is descended from the missionaries who served here. We thought all connection to our ancestors had been lost. But now, because of you, we can walk where they walked. We can read their words. We can know them." The child looked up at Jake with wide, curious eyes. "Did you really buy this place for just $100? She asked. Jake smiled and knelt down so he was at eye level with the child. "I did," he said. "Best $100 I ever spent. But you found a treasure worth millions of dollars," the child said, clearly trying to work through the logic. "Why did you give it away?" Jake thought for a moment before answering. "You know what I learned," he said gently. "Sometimes the real treasure isn't what you find. It's what you're able to give. And what you're able to save." He stood and looked around at the mission, at the people filling its rooms with life and laughter, at the solid stone walls that would stand for generations yet to come. "I bought this place thinking I would restore it," Jake said, more to himself than to anyone else. "But I think maybe it restored me instead." As the sun began to set over the desert hills, painting the mission walls in shades of gold and amber, Jake walked slowly through the courtyard. His footsteps echoed on the stone floor, mixing with the sounds of visitors and the eternal whisper of the desert wind. He'd come here looking for purpose, for something beautiful to save. What he'd found was so much more than treasure. He'd found a connection to the past, a gift for the future, and a reminder that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars. The mission stood strong and proud, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. And Jake Morrison, The construction worker who'd bought it for $100 had given it the greatest gift of all, a second chance.